Harper. Nick, we are standing by for a statement from Joe Biden, but what's happening on the ground?
Hearing some information, though, coming from Joe Biden's campaign manager within just the last few minutes, and they're certainly striking an upbeat, optimistic tone. We've heard from campaign manager Jen O'Malley Dillon, who in a live call to reporters within just the last few minutes has said that the results indicate we are on a clear path to victory this afternoon. So that would mean in the coming hours. She went on to point out that currently Joe Biden is up in Wisconsin, Michigan, and holds a lead in Pennsylvania as well. She said that if all of the ballot counters did what the president has asked everyone to do, to stop counting the ballots at this very moment, as it stands, Joe Biden would be the winner. Obviously, that's not going to happen. The votes will continue to be counted. But the message coming out of the Biden camp this morning seems to indicate that they feel that things look a lot rosier for them this morning than when they went to bed very late last night.
Well, certainly. And does that explain the latest tweets that have come out of Trump's Twitter handle?
Yeah, certainly a couple of angry tweets within the last 20-25 minutes or so from the president, again continuing to push these claims, baseless claims of fraud. He's doubling down on that. He's now zeroing in on the idea of ballot dumps. So these are absentee or postal ballots that arrive at postal centres potentially perhaps a little bit later than planned and then get counted and then put Joe Biden, the Democratic candidate, ahead, because many more Democratic voters have voted by mail in this election than Republicans. Both of those tweets from the president seem to suggest a very angry mood within the White House this morning. But it is interesting that there is no whiff of an idea that he is backing away from those claims that he made last night, suggesting that he had won the presidency, even though counting was still scheduled to go for millions more votes, and fraudulently claiming that the Democrats were trying to steal this election. But simply for the sake of argument, Nick, what the US president is saying is that he was leading. And he was leading quite handsomely. So if you have a certain trend, that trend should continue. But if you have, all of a sudden a number of votes that are coming in which are totally reverse to that trend, then one can raise a certain question. Is because there is it's an impression that everyone who polled in one particular way, let's say early voting or by postal ballot, were only supporting one candidate. It seems that way. And everyone who came out to vote and cast their ballots on November 3rd were either voting for the president or the other side. In a sense, that seemed more normal.
Well, yes and no. I mean, I think going into election day, we knew that we were going to see some early trends, but those early trends would skew one way or another and wouldn't present the full picture. For example, in Pennsylvania, they were not allowed to count any mail-in ballots before election day, and they were going to prioritize the counting of walk-in, people who've turned up, votes ahead of those mail-in ballots. So the thinking was that with more Republicans than Democrats turning up to vote on election day, and with more Democrats putting their ballot in the mail ahead of election day, we would begin to see, first of all, a lead for President Trump. But as those postal votes began to get counted, as a second priority after the walk-in votes, we would potentially begin to see the Democrat candidate Joe Biden beginning to take a lead. And that is why we've seen the reversal of that trend, that it was, yes, skewing for Donald Trump to begin with, but there were all those uncounted Democratic votes. And although the president is angry about that, we already knew that going into election day, that we could see potentially some leans in certain directions that wouldn't represent the true nature when all of the ballots were counted.
Yes, and there could be a rationale for what is happening right now as well, and what Trump essentially is doing, raising a lot of questions, raising doubt, raising a finger or a whole bunch of fingers of suspicion at what is happening, but won't he need to back it up if he wants to take it up to the court, substantiate it somehow, prove it that there's been something, some sort of malpractice has been done here?
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's all very well and good for the president to say we are going to go to the Supreme Court, but yes, he needs some substantial evidence to prove why he has a case for that to happen. However, I guess we are seeing the worst case fears that Democrats had going into this election. This idea that Donald Trump for many months seems to have been sowing the seeds that the Democrats, with their mail-in ballots, would try to steal the election. He has put forward those claims, which are baseless, completely unverified, that mail-in ballots are in some way less important than people who turn up to vote in the polls, and that mail-in ballots are also open to election fraud, something that hasn't been proven on a mass scale here in the United States. So the Democrats were fearful of that, and we know that they set aside about $10 million to fight legal challenges right across the country. And they've been talking about this morning, Joe Biden's campaign tweeting, saying that we won't rest until every vote is counted. The campaign manager calling it outrageous, unprecedented and correct, and that they had legal teams standing by if they need to go into individual precincts, individual counties, to ensure that all the votes are counted and none of them are disqualified.
Yes, and we just put Donald Trump's Twitter feed on the screen just seconds ago, and the counters are moving on the likes and the retweets. So it seems that his tweet storm that he seems to be getting into now is really remobilizing his base, and it's not just about social media, pretty much, and pretty soon it'll be seen on the streets as well. And what kind of an impact could that have on America this Wednesday?
Well, that is the other fear that Democrats have had going into this election. They say that Donald Trump, really throughout the last few months, as we've seen protests, for example, for Black Lives Matter over the summer months, they say that Donald Trump was fanning the flames, inciting violence on the streets. And they were worried that we may get to this scenario where we're potentially waiting hours, potentially waiting days for the final result to come in. And during that time, we would have a president who is fomenting trouble, who is saying things on social media or in person that would play very well to his base, who are suspicious of the Democrat motivations for counting all of the ballots, and that may lead to protests on the street, which may in turn lead to some sort of violence. We've seen the boarding up of big cities right across the US, including Philadelphia, just 30 minutes from here. The National Guard out there on the streets, worried that there may be some potential flare-ups. The hope is that won't happen, but the Democrats will be looking at the president and saying that with tweets like these, that are unverified, that are baseless, that he is continuing to stir that pot of potential trouble.
Nick, you keep saying unverified and baseless, but on what grounds do you say baseless? Because, you know, I mean, if it has never been proved that these ballots have been used fraudulently in the past, they were of a very small number in the past. I mean, in this particular case, they are huge. And that's what he's commenting about, the size of these ballots. And there is perhaps, you know, a systemic problem also that could lead to an excess which, you know, people may have cast more than one vote. These are just, or is that entirely, you know, why is it not a possibility is what I'm trying to ask. Is it absolutely clear? Is it a foolproof system?
Well, when analysts have looked at this at the past and they've worked out the statistics when it comes to fraud, they have found that it's somewhere in the region of 0.00001% of ballots that are in some way fraudulent, and that could be from a number of different reasons. So it's a very, very small percentage, a minuscule percentage in US presidential elections. And yet Donald Trump has repeatedly pushed this claim that mail-in ballots are open to widespread fraud, that the Democrats would be able to somehow put in a whole load of ballots that simply shouldn't have existed. He has pushed that throughout the weeks in his rallies and on Twitter as well. So I think it's from an analytical, statistical viewpoint that it's being looked at, and the numbers are very, very tiny.
Mm-hmm. Or maybe he's hinting at some other sort of interference, foreign interference, that was an issue in 2016 as well, although at that time it was said that there was foreign interference in his favor, and that again that entire issue couldn't be proven at all. There was no collusion that was found, and as far as we know now, nothing has come out of it.
No, there has been no suggestion as to this election, but there was fear going into it some of his own intelligence chiefs were looking at the possibility of interference from Iran or Russia. From what we're seeing so far today, there doesn't seem to be any major suggestion that there has been interference in this election this time around.
Thanks very much for being with us, Nick, joining us from Delaware. Moving on then, let's introduce you to our panel of guests. We have Pinak Ranjan Chakrabarti, former Secretary Economic Relations in the Ministry of External Affairs. We have Michael Davis, who's a scholar on international relations, the Weatherhead East Asia Institute, Columbia University.
We're also joined by Yashwant Raj, he's a senior journalist, and also Preeti Upara. She's a geopolitical expert and an Indian who's there in America. First, if I could come to you, Master Pinak Ranjan Chakrabarti, the entire situation as it's developing right now, do you feel that we will get to a situation where this will finally end up in courts, and then it might take even longer than what was being anticipated earlier in terms of completing the count?
Well, I think if the count is completed and there is a clear winner that emerges, that would naturally be the preferred option. Any one of them can get to 270 and be declared the next president. But if it happens that that there is a challenge mounted to all this, even to the result, then I think it gets far more complicated. And I think then finally the courts will have to rule. If you remember the Bush versus Al Gore, contest that took place, there were paper ballots, and the Chad issue had come in, that whether the Chads had been sort of perforated properly, and so whether the ballot was therefore valid or invalid. It had gone to the, I think, Supreme Court, and they had ruled on it. But anyway, that election went in favor of George Bush. But I think what could happen here again is that it all depends on where it's heading after the counting. But I am doubtful that that President Trump can mount another legal challenge to the process of counting. I'm not sure whether that can be done or will be agreed to by the court. I think there has been some challenges mounted even before the election as to the process followed by, let's say, Pennsylvania, and I don't think the court could give a very clear decision on it, or it was tied or something, and so there was nothing done to change that process. Now, it's all a complicated business because the US is a federal country and the states have these powers to do, set their own rules, etc. It's quite different, and unlike India, where the Election Commission lays down the rules and everybody in India has to follow it, and there is no second, charter of rules, etc. So I think it's complicated in the US because of its long history as a democracy and how they had, how they went into this electoral college business. And it continues because there is no consensus in, of course, getting rid of it, and which would be the good thing actually, because the the candidates can go for the popular vote, and whoever wins the popular vote can be declared, which is normally the case in other presidential forms of election. But there it is. I mean, this is the United States of America with its own complicated system, and I think they will have to sort it out themselves, or the courts will have to sort it out.
Mr. Yashwant Raj, what would you think? Do you think that the U.S. system of election needs to be changed? Perhaps go for the popular vote, because they look at it more perhaps like a tennis match where perhaps one party can win many more points, but he has to win the sets in the end to win the match. So here you have to win the states to win the election, even if you have won overall many less votes.
Yes, thanks for having me. Yes, there is a very active debate happening here in this country, and for a long time, and it got, it became a major issue again in 2016 when Hillary Clinton, she won the popular vote by almost 3 million votes.
Yes.
And yet it was President Trump who won the presidency with the Electoral College vote. So there is this whole idea about whether they should switch to popular vote, and And what also happens additionally is that most of these polls that tend to come before the polling actually, they are all, they measure the national mood. And a few of them also do a deep dive into battleground states, but the national polls tend to reflect the mood of the country. But when it's actually the electoral college votes that decide who's going to win or who's going to lose. So there has been a debate here for a long time now, and 2016 it got a major boost again, whether they should switch to just let the popular vote decide. But as of now, we don't have that system, so we'll have to go with what they have.
Okay. Right, Michael Davis, if I could come to you, Mr. Davis, in terms of how things are going right now, the kind of mandate that we're getting, does that indicate that America is moving towards a situation where perhaps it will need to look at how it conducts its elections and how it chooses its leaders? Because some might argue, as Yashwant was saying, the debate was there, that the election process, particularly for the post of president, is not truly representative.
Well, I think, of course, that's obvious. There's several fundamental constitutional changes that could be made and should be made. The U.S. Constitution, as we know, is the oldest written one in the world, so it's kind of got its feet in the past in many ways in how it conducts business. And those constitutional changes have all been on prominent display recently. One is that the Senate in the federal system in the U.S. Represents each state equally. So I'm from the state of Hawaii, and we have as many senators as the state of New York, which is where I'm actually at the moment. And so that's one thing that has always empowered, especially the center of the country, that the so-called red states have way more power than their popular vote. Even right now, we know Biden is ahead by about 2.5 million votes in this election right now. So that's one thing. And the Senate itself is being chosen as we speak as well. Most of the senators, a lot of Republican senators up for election. But of course, they're not going to allow any change. The only way you could get that kind of change is have a sweeping victory by the Democrats so that they can ram through some kind of changes. Even the point that was most recently a big contentious point, the appointment of a Supreme Court justice, the way it's done politically in the U.S. I know India struggles over how it appoints its judges as well. But the appointment of the Supreme Court justice is controlled by the Senate. And so those red states control that because they manage in this system that's unevenly balanced and gives more power to rural voters. They manage to hold on to the Senate very often. And so the result is even if Biden wins and they don't win the Senate, he's going to have a hard time getting the justices he wants appointed. So the reason for reforming that is great. So these are two federalism points that are important. And then, of course, this electoral college makes virtually no sense at all. But what it does in a country like the United States, where progressives and Democrats are on the borders of the country or in the big cities, is it gives rural America perhaps a more pronounced voice in American politics. And again, those people who would have to make the kinds of reforms. In India, the parliament on its own can amend the Constitution. Yeah. And of course, India's had about 100 amendments. But in the U.S., the Constitution is very rigid. So while virtually anybody, even probably the Republicans, if they were honest, could recognize the system is very undemocratic in some ways, I don't think there's going to be any chance of changing it. And certainly now, I mean, Democrats were hoping, based on polls, that Biden might have a sweeping victory and drag in a few senators along with it. But as it turns out, it's turned out to be a squeaker. And so the next president, if it is Biden, is going to face a lot of limitations. And way down the list is going to be constitutional reform, because he's not going to be able to pull it off.
Mr. Pala, if we have to look at trying to bring about change from the people, that's how democracy works. But you have in the U.S., you have this establishment. And in fact, Joe Biden is an establishment man. And Donald Trump is not an establishment man. So he was the one who was supposed to be disruptionist and change everything. And perhaps he did it in his own way. But to bring about changes that would have to be, you'd have to require something like that to happen. Do you think that the U.S. system allows that kind of change, or people have to come in through the establishment?
Well, firstly, namaste, and thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be on your show. Yes, I think America needs reform on so many levels, from immigration all the way to their electoral process. It's tricky because on any given day, the Electoral College could, benefit one party or the other, and it has, I think, over the course of several decades. So it's, you have to always think about the precedent of any change that gets made, because it might help you today, it might not help you down the future. So change definitely, obviously, occurs firstly in the person themselves, and then that projects onto society, states, and then the nation. I mean, one point I do want to say, it might be time for America to really get on with the EVMs, electoral voting machines, which, by the way, in India we use. That's a country of 1 billion people who vote, and they use it, and it's surprisingly hack-proof in many ways. Although I wouldn't, I don't know how that would go down in America. I think they need to make sure they get the right machines from the right nation. You might want to avoid a few providers. But yes, it's tricky because the Democratic Party always wants to talk about change and power to the people, and yet the person that they put up is as establishment as it gets, and that's the person that they've also come out and voted for. And there's quite a fraction of the DNC, the Democratic Party itself, that the burners and the real sort of the progressives who are not thrilled with this. So there's a divide already. I think there needs to be some soul searching done for both parties and for the country as well once this election is finally over. I think as a country we need to come together and ask ourselves what's not working within us and the system.
Certainly, that would be one area that you mentioned, Preeti, that India and America could cooperate on, perhaps managing of elections and conduct of elections. And Yashwant, in terms of exploring that possibility and many others, perhaps, in terms of how India and America could move forward together, it's already been on an upward trend, the last decade or so. But during the Trump reign, it was even better, the kind of ties, the way that they have progressed in the strategic sphere. Do you think that will stay the course, regardless of who would come up out of this particular contest?
Yes, thanks so much, Gaurav, for the question. A very senior U.S. State Department official was in India recently, and on the way back, he did a press conference in which he said that the relationship enjoys widespread bipartisan support in the U.S., and every subsequent administration has only improved it, and they kind of build on each other. And so, there was President Bush, during whose time India and the U.S. signed the nuclear deal, which remains the high water. Set a very high standard for the relationship. And then President Obama, first U.S. president to visit India twice during his term, and then also the Republic Day parade, chief guest, etc. And then President Trump, his personal equation relationship with Prime Minister Modi, then the Houston Howdy Modi event, and Namaste Trump in Ahmedabad. And each administration improves in the previous one, and each administration also has has had its own problems. Like during President Trump's time, we have had, you've seen trade tensions rise to unprecedented levels with, GSP, the Generalized System of Preferences being suspended, etc. So, but again, every administration has built on the previous administration's work, and it's only kind of improved. So there is bipartisan support for the relationship, and people in India, officials in India and the US agree that, it will only grow. And as things change in the world, the relationship will only grow. It's safe in the hands of the next president, whoever it is.
Right. Michael Davis, how would you look at Biden presidency in terms of a shift in policy? Because, well, as India is concerned, it enjoys bipartisan support. But when somebody wants to change a president and vote someone out, they want change, obviously. And when we look at Biden, he's coming perhaps because of the health care, the aspect that people were afraid of COVID and the possible bad management of COVID by the Trump administration. So assuming that Biden takes charge, what do you think would be his key priorities?
Well, I think one of them, of course, domestic policies are all what politics are about, and in campaigns, that's to be emphasized. But Biden spent years on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He's very much an experienced person in dealing with international relations. And he's made very clear his chief objection to Trump is like the lone cowboy in international relations. He makes a lot of noise and he says things. In fact, it's interesting. Recently, people were doing opinion polls in China and Hong Kong and finding that Trump was more popular than Biden with more dissident people in those societies because they thought he really, would push China and attack China and everything. And of course, if you're an activist in these places, you like someone who makes life hard for Beijing. Yes. But in fact, all Trump does in many ways is talk. I think the big thing you would see with Biden is the standard Democratic Party approach would be more multilateralism. So the allies, the U.S., when Trump won his election, the first thing he did was abandon TPP, mostly just because it had Obama's name on it, which is probably why he also wants to abandon the health care law that exists because it's called Obamacare. So he personalizes these things. He's not been successful at abandoning that, but he did dump TPP. And then he goes on and he wants to create pressures on China regarding trade, but he's alienated his allies in that project because he's not approached it in a multilateral way. In fact, the one trade agreement where he had everyone except China and Asia on board, he abandoned it. So I would expect, that because of labor support for the Democratic Party, they may not, Biden has not emphasized that in his campaign, but I would expect U.S. would go back into TPP after the election because there's a consensus across the aisle in the U.S. between the two parties that the relationship with China has not been successful and that they should be tough on China. So I would expect less bombastic from Biden, but maybe more working with his allies and trying to repair the damage in international relations left behind by Trump. Some people worry that will mean that he will be too easily manipulated by China, that China's, even my colleague, I visit as a professor at the Jindal Global University, and my colleague Shireen Challah has worried about that, has mentioned that at least, that that Chinese would know how to play the Democrats a bit more. I'm not too worried about it because I think I've spent a lot of time in Washington, and I think there's a general consensus that the old vision of how to get along with China and that China would someday reform was failed. And so I would expect this more of a multilateral approach. I don't think they're going to abandon all the Trump initiatives when it comes to trying to pressure China on technology transfers and things of this nature. What they will do also, I think they're going to be more human rights sensitive, so they're probably going to speak out more on Xinjiang and the Uyghur situation and probably more on Hong Kong. Trump was kind of a reluctant participant in the pressure put on China over Hong Kong.
Okay, let's bring in Ambassador Chakrabarti again into this. And Ambassador Chakrabarti, if it is still, although right now it seems that Biden has got some wind in his sails, but if it's still Trump, do you feel that it will be much of the same? He will continue with his striding stance against China and so many other global issues as well, or his second term he can ratchet it up further, or maybe some were saying that he might use the opportunity to strike a deal with China as well and on some other fronts?
Well, one thing that if he wins, if he comes out a winner, then he will certainly feel that he has been vindicated in the sense that the kind of policies that he has followed, America first, etc., and going away from all the multilateral deals, JCPOA, TPP, the Atlantic, trade deal, etc., and the climate change agreement, the Paris agreement. So I think he might say that, look, I am vindicated. I have won. The people of my country or the people of America have voted me back to power, which means they support my policies, the kind of policies I have followed. So he might continue along the same line, making adjustments where necessary. I am not so sure whether he's going to use, he might use the pressure on China to do a deal, because I think the corporate sector and the business lobby, American business lobby, has profited enormously by the shift of manufacturing to China. And there is clearly, I think, a bipartisan consensus that this whole concept, a very flawed concept, as many of us at that time had thought, that somehow supporting China's integration with the global economy and allowing China to prosper economically will somehow change China into, a beacon of democracy, etc. Now, Chinese leaders were smart enough to see that the Soviet Union broke up precisely because of the fact that it had a weak economy. And, the whole issue of, because the Soviet Union was not integrated with the world economy in the sense that China is today. And China is a large economy, probably as large as the United States in another few years. But it has opened its cards in the sense that China has played its cards, saying that, look, we have arrived and we would now like to take on the United States. So they are pushing at their periphery at every point. They began it in South China Sea. They got embarrassed because there was no pushback from the Americans. Now there is a little bit of pushback through these phone-op operations in South China Sea and maybe the Indo-Pacific, the Malabar exercises, etc.
Yes.
But these are still symbolic in the sense that these are not really like, let's say, NATO or something that is an alliance to
yes.
Its role was in Europe.
Okay.
So what Trump could do is to carry on with this kind of practices or this kind of thing, but he could also do a somersault at any time, because that's the way he works. And if he sees some benefit, he can do a somersault, change course, etc. But I'm not so sure on the Quad that this somersault would be possible. But I don't rule it out, because he can do anything. But I don't know whether the American establishment and others, the Pentagon, for example, has worked very hard to build this defense relationship with India, and whether they would be very happy to just walk back and go home and not carry on with this defense relationship. Okay. So I don't think that might happen in the domain of defense and security, but in trade, in any other domain, it could.
Sure.
Well, for now, uncertainty seems to be the operative word right now, and to just extend this further, if you look at the possibility of even a tie, let's try and explore that as well. Now, what if there's a tie? Let's bring up certain scenarios for you, if we could have that on the screen as well. And those scenarios really speak to the fact that there could be two of them broadly, and that is when Biden wins all the states that Hillary Clinton won in 2016. That is a given as far as those scenarios are concerned. That is something that is emerging as well, it seems, at this stage.
In fact, that has emerged, in fact, and Biden has also taken one of the states, Arizona, which was won
had
by
gone to Trump.
Yeah.
He's wrestled it back. And further on, if you look at what could really happen, is Biden also gains Michigan, Wisconsin and Arizona
which is already happened, yes.
Happened. And the other scenario there again, the presumption is that he gets all the states won by Hillary Clinton, and he's added on to that as well. And in this particular scenario, if we look at the other possibility, is Biden also gains Michigan and Pennsylvania, having won 1 of 5 Nebraska votes. So that could get Biden across as well, couldn't it, Mark?
Right. And so what happens then? It happens that, well, the House of Representatives then chooses the president in the case of a tie. And each state delegation in House will have one vote. And simple majority of states of 26 or more votes is needed for the win. So at that end, and the vice president-elect serves as the acting president in case of a deadlock. So the House has to keep voting till the deadlock is broken, and the Senate chooses the vice president by a simple majority. So this is the case in case of a tie. And if the Senate also gets deadlocked, then the Presidential Succession Act comes into play, and well, the House Speaker, the House Speaker becomes the acting president till the House and the Senate deadlocks are broken. So these are some unusual circumstances, so we have to look at these possibilities as things stand. Mr. Yashwant Raj, we are looking at India-US relations, which we said has had bipartisan support. But, you know, some would think that even though it has had bipartisan support, and the Democrats have said that, you know, they do support India, but they are far more liberal in their views. And perhaps, you know, the immigration policy is something that India may benefit from. But otherwise, you know, what do you think? Do you think that really the Democrats have done enough for Indian business interests abroad, for perhaps India's emergence as a greater power in the world, perhaps more support in the UN Security Council for one, or on the international stage itself?
Yes, sir. Again, let me go back to President Obama's tenure. If you remember, he declared U.S. support for India's claim to a UN Security Council permanent position during his visit to India in 2012, if you remember. And U.S. became the first P5 country to come out in support of India's claim to a UNSC seat. So that is a big, big plus. And then it was again President Obama's tenure when India was declared a major defense partner, which essentially entitles, which allows India to buy sensitive defense technology from the U.S. and stuff. So again, I go back to my point about India enjoying bipartisan support. I mean, every president will have some pet peeves and pet favorite subjects and things that they will push. But by and large, the relationship enjoys bipartisan support, and not only just in the executive, but also among lawmakers. And there might be a few hearings at which India comes in for criticism on some issues. But again, we need to look at the broader relationship, which has had kind of very, very wide support and broad support in the U.S. So it would be not correct to say one party is better for India than the other, because after all, India has to deal with both. I mean, India can't choose who it wants to talk to. India can't shut down and say, okay, Democrats are in parts, so we'll not talk to Democrats, or the Republicans are in parts, so we'll not talk to Republicans. India has to talk to both of them. And the good thing for India is that there is widespread support among Democrats and Republicans for a relationship with India to grow. And
okay.
Certainly, the other factor, Preeti Uppala, if I could come to you, is the Indian American community there, and we've seen how things have evolved there as well in terms of changing preferences, the shifting preference from mostly Democratic support to some Republican now as well. We've seen that happening. I'm told that Preeti is not with us at the moment. If I could come to you, Ambassador Chakrabarti, on that, how much of that has been a factor as far as these elections are concerned? Do you think that is something that may be tilting the balance here as well?
Is this for me?
I was told that you're not with us. Go ahead, Preeti.
I'm with you. Can I take the question?
Yes,
Please,
go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay, sorry, because I was this is the India-US relationship is a speciality of mine, so I keep hearing people talk about it. I'm like, I just wanted to chip in. Look, recently with what's happened with the Quad, the 2+2 dialogues, as well as the $20 billion defense trade deal between the US and India. That's an extraordinary step, I think, historic in many ways. I feel that this present administration has done more, I would say, than its counterparts in the past to really strengthen the relationship with India. And I think they really do view, they look at a common threat and they get that. And I think, when Secretary Mike Pompeo and Mark Esper, when they visit India, they're very clear on what's going on in the Indo-Pacific and that they're going to back India. And I do take their word for it. They're obviously putting their money where their mouth is. And obviously a different administration, it would be hard to completely back out of all of that, because I think that the way that the two countries are bound up, thankfully, you can't just escape from that. But I would hate to see the Quad turn into a trio, if you know what I mean. I think as far as the community goes, yes, there has been a shift. I think the recent stances of the DNC towards internal policies of India, whether it's Kashmir or CAA or a few other points, has not really gotten down well with the community here. They have felt that the DNC has been a little antagonistic towards India, the government of India, and in a way, the Indian American community themselves. I think they've personalized it a lot. And I have seen, a lot of people who've made the shift to center or even right. And I think the DNC is going to lose a lot more Indian voters if they continue that. They can't sort of keep doubling down on that because they have strong lobbies on the other side and they want to pander to a certain vote block, which seems to be happening. I think there's, that's a dangerous path, and I don't think anybody wants to go down that track. So I hope that whichever administration comes in, that they continue this relationship, because I think for the next half century, the India-US a global strategic alliance is going to be the most important one moving forward. And post-COVID, nobody wants a world that's run by China. This is for sure, which puts India actually in a very good position.
Certainly, I'm sure neither of the administrations, whichever one comes in,
and strengthen that.
Whichever one comes in will allow that, Mark.
Yes, indeed. We'd like to thank Yashwant Raj for joining us. Thanks very much. We understood you had only a little time with us, but we've extended that a little longer than you had given us. Thanks very much for being with us.
Thanks so much.
And we're also joined by Kate Fisher, who joins us from Washington, D.C. now with an update from there. Kate, so the situation is quite... it's interesting in some ways, but it's also quite frightening when one looks at the possibilities of a lengthy battle in court, and also concerns about let's say what's going to happen in case one party decides to take to the streets. So what give us the sense of the ground situation?
Well, there is a lot of bluster from both sides at the moment, especially Donald Trump's camp. He is still in the White House behind me here, strategizing with his team about how they are going to deal with the current situation, which is still hugely unclear from a national perspective. He's just completed, or his campaign team has just completed a call to journalists talking about how they're feeling at the moment, and the upshot is that is very confident, very bullish, saying that we are in a very, very, very good position, suggesting that Donald Trump is on course to win Pennsylvania, they say, by 40,000 votes. That's their projection. Of course, there's still more than 1 million votes to be counted in that state, and they have 3 extra days after polling day to do so. That's something that Donald Trump has been railing against. Last night at the White House, we heard him say that he believed he was victorious, even though those votes are yet to be counted. He's continuing, his campaign is continuing with that very confident approach this morning, even though there are signs that in certain states the needle, as they say, is starting to tip towards Joe Biden as those postal votes and early votes that came in before the official polling day are counted up.
Yeah, certainly. And Kate, at this time, at this point of time, a lot of these tweets that are being put out by Donald Trump, or some of the retweets that he's been doing, are also being removed by Twitter, as some or all of it could be misleading. So that again is a dimension. If those tweets are disappearing from the Twitter feed, then how can they become valid grounds if this matter ends up in court?
Yeah, that's right. Donald Trump is falsely saying that he has won this election. The votes, as I say, have not yet been counted, and it is perfectly legal for them to continue to be counted. So Twitter has, Twitter has taken it into their own hands. Their policing of factual inaccuracies on their social media site. They have said that these tweets are not correct because all the votes have not yet been counted, and that is the law in this country, so they've removed them. For example, Donald Trump was saying just within the last hour on Twitter that last night I was leading often solidly in many key states. In most of them were democratically run states, and then one by one they started to magically disappear. Very strange in capital letters, and the pollsters got it completely wrong. So there he is, railing against states run by Democratic governors. He is blaming them and alleging that some kind of fraud or mismanagement has occurred. Again, we have no evidence that that has happened, and it is perfectly legal and perfectly normal in an American election for the votes to still be being counted today, especially given how many extra ballots were cast.
But if I can, comment on that and just for the sake of argument, give a counter view. Election day, Kate, is supposed to be the 3rd of November, and it's the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November, and it's decided as per the convention. It's just a single day. But if this early voting system and postal ballot system and all these other systems are allowed, then you actually have an election season in the United States that begins way in in October, and it carries on well past November 3rd. What's the whole point of the sanctity of November 3rd then as the election day? That is the kind of big argument that can perhaps be made about this electoral process.
It's a very good point, and there is, I would say that sanctity is not quite the case anymore. We've been reporting on this election for months and months, if not years, because let's face it, as soon as Donald Trump won the election in 2016, he kind of got back on the campaign trail. He's been holding rallies ever since he moved into the White House, and the early voting system in this country has been in the states that run it, has been introduced to allow more access for people to be able to vote. So the reason that early voting is here is so that people who have jobs that mean that they can't attend a polling station on one specific day, or they have family commitments, caring commitments, or they can't afford to take a day off work to vote. They are able to do so in different ways. And that is one of the reasons the Republican Party traditionally do not like that, because they prefer, generally their voters are able to go to a polling station on polling day, and that means they get a higher turnout, whereas traditionally Democratic voters are more likely to be working class and therefore perhaps not able to find time on one specific polling day to cast their ballot.
Right. Well, that argument still stands, and we'll have to see if that is actually made if it comes to that juncture. Kate, thanks for joining us for the moment from Washington, D.C. And let's, for the final time, go across to our guests as well. If I could first ask you, Michael Davis, at this juncture, do you feel that there will be this eventuality? Will it be necessary that the courts will need to be invoked, or are we going to see that that may not be required at all? We might have a verdict. Would you stick your neck out and say who might that be in favor of?
Well, it looks now like the situation is leaning heavily towards Biden, because if you look at Nevada and Arizona, it's very close, but the reportage I've heard is most of the votes that are missing that they're waiting for these mail-in votes, and the Democrats have been using that method of voting more than the Republicans, in part because Trump attacked it. So the loyal Trump supporters were discouraged from using that method. And so the Democrats were doing it. I would add to the comment that was just made a little bit ago that in addition to having the technology to allow this kind of voting and spread the voting time out a bit, we've also had a pandemic. Yes. So the idea that voters would vote online or through the mail is a way to avoid having people violate the social distancing rules. So I'm here in New York City, and I saw lines stretching way around the blocks, several blocks of people voting early even. So I think a lot of this is absolutely justified this year, but like a lot of things this year, once you start figuring out you can do these things, for example, I teach 2 courses in Hong Kong from New York City via Zoom. Once you figure out you can do these things, it becomes part of the norm. And so I think some of this will be left with us long after the pandemic is gone. But I think that pandemic is very much at play here, and it's difficult to attack the idea that people would use mail-in voting in this particular time. So that's one thing. But on the who's going to win, I think in Michigan and Wisconsin, again, the same results suggest. So quite frankly, it appears that even if Biden doesn't take Pennsylvania, takes Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, Nevada, and Maine, that he'll have 271 electoral votes and win the election. So yes. The tendency is certainly leaning in Biden's way, although not guaranteed, because you can't be sure those last votes that are being counted are, as we have experienced so far, leaning towards the Democrats.
Right, and Pinak Ranjan Chakrabarti, people were commenting about the age of the candidates involved. Would you see that, in either case, causing a bit of a concern to the way things are going to be handled in world affairs? Because we've seen presidents of, let's say, the age group of late 40s to early 50s have been rather efficient in running their affairs in terms of their enthusiasm.
Well, both are in their 70s, and I think they're separated by 4 or 5 years at best, I think. And if you look at their age, then there's nothing much to choose from. In fact, when I look at television, I find Biden more sprightly, leaner than Mr. Trump. And clearly he walks or does some exercise, which President Trump probably doesn't. And so I think, I don't think age is going to be too much of a factor. Although some people have tried to use it, and that Mr. Biden is too old and so may not be very active, etc. And the Republicans have even said that he will hand over everything to his Vice President Kamala Harris, and so all those arguments have been made, all those allegations have been made, and they are all over now, and now we are really into counting. So I don't think age is a factor here, but you are right that we have had younger presidents, from Clinton, George Bush, Obama. They were very young, much younger when they became president. So, but this is a change that can happen in, in democracy, that you can have an older president or prime minister. We have seen in India older prime ministers. So
yes,
I don't think that we can make it a norm that you need a young leader all the time, and so I don't think that should be a consideration at this time.
Okay, and Preeti Bala, if I could come to you and ask you in terms of where would you think this mandate is going to lie in just a matter of a day, maybe a day and a half, we may have a verdict if the courts don't intervene?
Well, it's never over until the fat lady stops singing, I suppose. I think this is going to really go down to the wire. I suspect there's some drama in store for us. I don't think it's quite over yet. I guess in the next few days or even later today, we'll find out where things stand. I do want to say that there's something very fateful and otherworldly about this election. It's not normal, and it's almost like it's written in the stars, so to speak, who's going to come into the White House next, because I just feel that they're intertwined with the geopolitical landscape that's taking form, and they're I think they're going to have to lead the country, and for better or for worse. I just hope that we get the right leadership that can deal with the great issues, the great threats, the great adversaries out there. And particularly as an Indian American, obviously I care about an administration that is going to be respectful to a loyal and a good ally, and see that relationship as extremely important moving forward. And this is a very divided country. I think this election is very symbolic of actually what's going on in society. And instead of elections are supposed to bring people together.
Yes.
I think this election has divided us even further. So I think when all of this is done, we really do need to do some soul searching, come together and, really think, I think, of
True.
A better country for us, and
I think
larger, more.
Right, I think we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much.
Let's just see how things pan out.
Yes, and we'd have to leave it there. Thanks very much, Preeti Upala and Michael Davis and Pinakaranjan Chakrabarti for joining us in this discussion. And well, it seems that it's not over, and it's not going to be over for some time. But it's also getting very interesting because there are a lot of unusual permutations and combinations that are possible. We even talked about a possibility of a tie. And well, let's see how it plays out.
Well, yes, and let's hope that whatever is to happen happens soon, fast enough, doesn't really linger on for too long for things to become really unstable and uncertain. That would not be good for anyone at all. We'll leave it there at the moment and keep you updated with other news as well. That will be coming up very soon. Stay with DD India.